Welcome, I'm Dr. Liz Watkins. I convene the British Association of Film, Television and Screen Studies Special Interest Group on Colour and Film with Professor Sarah Street and Vicky Jackson, who are based at the University of Bristol. Today's seminar is on Bombay Film Colour. We'll hear from Dr. Kirsty Sinclair Dootson and Professor Ranjani Mazumdar as they explore the outcomes of their two-year AHRC-funded project, the Colouring Indian Film History Research Network. That project has been exploring the archives, histories and industries of colour film in Bombay, focusing on the years 1945 to 1982. Kirsty Sinclair Dootson is an associate professor in art and material cultures of Britain at the University of College London. She's the author of The Rainbow's Gravity, Colour Materiality and British Modernity. Ranjani Mazumdar is Professor of Cinema Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University School of Arts and Aesthetics. Ranjani's books include Bombay Cinema, an archive of the city, and with Nitin Govil, the Indian Film Industry 2014. For the seminar today, we'll hear both of their presentations, which will be followed by a discussion with time to ask questions. So we ask all attendees to turn the cameras and microphones off during the presentations. If you have a question for the speakers, then we encourage you to type it into the chat so the speakers have the opportunity to think and respond. There will be a Q&A, and at that point, we can invite you on screen to ask your questions directly. So the presentations will be recorded, but we will pause the recording before the Q&A. So the session will begin just a few moments and close at 1:15. So without further pause, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Kirsty Sinclair Dootson, as Assistant Professor at UCL and Lead Investigator of the AHRC Bombay Film Colour Project. Kirsty.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Liz. I think I can only see you, Liz. So you are responsible for letting me know if anything's going haywire. So do let me know. So thank you so much for the invitation to share today. And it's really nice to see many members of the research network in the room. I should also immediately apologize to Josh Umebi because some of this is going to be, and Sarah, this is going to be a little familiar. So for transparency, because Ranjani and I are in the process of putting together a dossier for Screen, where we've been kind of thinking through some of the key findings from the project. What I'm sharing today is the kind of introduction for that dossier. So I wanted to start with an image from a film that gets at some of the key ideas that we've been thinking about with this project. So the festival of Holi is here. Sprays of colours are flying. These lyrics are sung in V. Shantaram's film Navrang from 1959 as pink and crimson powders fly across the screen. Released when colour was rare in Bombay Cinema, Shantaram uses the Spring Festival of Holi, celebrated across the Indian subcontinent by throwing pigment, as a pretext for a song and dance sequence whose kineticism is matched only by its chromatism. Liquid streams of colour splatter across the twirling body of the film's star, while at the number's climax, jets of orange, blue and yellow are sprayed onto the camera lens from the trunk of a painted elephant. So in Navrang, which is a Hindi term that means 9 colours, colour is a visual pleasure and a technological spectacle. It was shot at Rajkamal Kamandir studio in Bombay on chromogenic monopack stock, which was recently developed technology capable of directly recording colour. It was processed at Technicolor London, which was the most advanced colour laboratory in Europe. And so colour also works as a political agent here. It's mediating India's colonial past and post-colonial futures. The film was released 12 years after Indian independence, and it's set in British India. And the film's poet protagonist composes romantic lyrics for his muse, as well as anti-imperial protest songs. So when, as you see here, the couple dance beneath a rainbow, singing joyously about colour, this sequence signifies both their romantic union and a utopian political dream of a brighter post-colonial tomorrow. So through its complicated color, Navrang anticipates the transformation of Bombay cinema in the following decade, as filmmakers increasingly used color as a technological marvel, artistic tool, and political force from the 1960s. Yet, despite color's profound significance to Bombay cinema, which is the kind of filmmaking that from the 1990s would become known as Bollywood, but Bombay cinema signifies an earlier historical period. There's very little scholarship on this topic. I'm showing some notable examples here notable exceptions here. So while recent work in color film history has moved beyond European and American cinema, India remains underanalyzed, particularly compared to other Asian contexts like China and Japan. Priya's work is kind of a notable exception in that she has thought quite deeply about color in Indian film. And Josh and Sarah's edited collection, Global Film Colour, was kind of foundational in globalizing these histories and does have material on India in it, authored by Ranjani and I. And this gap in the scholarship, though, is especially surprising given Bombay, the largest of India's regional film industries, was second only to Hollywood in its output and global reach in the 20th century. Colour has also eluded scholars of South Asian cinema, and even the National Museum of Indian Cinema in Mumbai features only one small display dedicated to colour, which you see at the right here. It's a very small panel in that museum. So, to address this major gap, Ranjani and I founded the Bombay Film Colour Research Network in 2023, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. This 2-year project brought together scholars, archivists, curators, and practitioners from across Asia, Europe, and North America to produce an online archive of resources. And I'll speak a little bit more about our project producing a kind of unofficial archive. So our project focused on a period of analog filmmaking in independent India when colour shifted from novelty to norm, from the end of British colonial rule in 1947 to its widespread use in colour television through state broadcaster Dootson in 1982. So while contributions to our project have certainly expanded this time period to include silent and colonial era films, as well as recent digital technologies, what was interesting is the 60s has emerged as a crucial decade. And this is something Ranjani is going to speak quite a lot more about in relation to her book. So in the 1960s, the increasing availability of monopack stocks and a growing domestic colour lab infrastructure intersected with India's emerging youth culture and modernizing ideas around caste, gender, and the family. Meanwhile, the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War and the turbulent premiership of Indira Gandhi forged colour cinema as a tool for international statecraft and domestic propaganda. So while the focus of our project was not the 1960s, this decade emerged through our research as particularly important to the techno-material, political, and aesthetic histories that we trace. And I'm just showing you here some screenshots from the website, and a few more will pop up as I speak, to give you a sense of the outcomes of the project, the most significant of which is producing the website as a kind of new repository of knowledge and archival information about Bombay Film Colour. So to consider why there's been very little attention to Bombay Film Colour and what makes it a distinctive and urgent case study for global histories of colour film, I just want to speak about 3 major themes that emerged through the project and through our research, which are methods, modernities, and mapping. So methods. Writing the history of Bombay Film Colour does not merely demand the addition of certain films and filmmakers to an established colour canon, nor an investigation into ethno-nationalist ideas about so-called Indian colour preferences, but it requires a re-evaluation of the methods and archives that we use for writing colour film history. Colour worked differently in Bombay than other contexts, and therefore left different kinds of archival traces. meaning that established methods that we have can't account for Bombay cinema. And this is something Purvi Gore, our network coordinator, and I wrote about in an article for Bioscope, thinking about different methods that we need for studying Bombay colour. So, as scholars of South Asian cinema have argued, the dispersed and incomplete nature of Indian film archives means novel historical methods are necessary. These methods employed by members of our network and that you can see through various contributions to our website include the incorporation of lost films into colour film history, new techniques for visual analysis, the use of oral history, an example of which you see here. And also, and this is really a very interesting outcome of the project, given the fact that songs in Hindi cinema are often better preserved than the films themselves, the use of music, LPs, records, songbooks are really critical to understand colour's role beyond extant film prints. And we can talk a lot more about this in the conversation. So we hope that these new methods and archival sources might further scholarship on other post-colonial colour contexts as well. So just a couple of examples here. Usha Iyer's fantastic blog post on and song booklets you can read on the website, and Ranjani's interview with laboratory worker Ujwal Nagorkar, who is also a network member. So modernity. In Bombay, what Sarah Street and Josh Umebi usefully call chromatic modernity was inextricable from colonial and post-colonial modernities. As Navrang makes clear, in Bombay, the hallmarks of chromatic modernity, like technological advances and transnational artistic exchanges, were inseparable from the legacies of British imperialism, political struggles for independence, and post-colonial aspirations. But that's also what made colour so apt for kind of exploring political autonomy as well. So following partition and independence, economic asymmetries between the global north and global south continued shaping India's access to and use of colour film. Colour also intersected with the new demands of a modernising national infrastructure, such as studios, labs, and film factories. Ranjani is going to speak a little bit more about this in relation to her book as well. So while the government certainly exploited the utopian connotations of post-colonial chromatic modernity, its polyvalent meanings across regions, religions, castes, and other contexts meant the state struggled to control the use of colour to produce a singular idea of Indian nationhood. And so just a couple of examples from the website here. Ram Navalia has written about the use of colour television in relation to state broadcaster Dootson and the transmission of a kind of propagandistic event of like the Asian Games. And then Purvi has also written about Films Division of India and their use of colour in their documentaries. So this is the state run documentary unit who produce documentaries. And so Purvi's done amazing work on their use of colour as well. So mapping. The profoundly transnational nature of Bombay filmmaking defies orthodox ideas about colour and national film style, demanding a different framework for interpretation. We therefore propose Bombay as a significant nodal point in a globally networked map of colour exchange, in which people, materials, technologies, and styles flowed into and out of the city. So Bombay Film Colour was always transnational. From the earliest Indo-German experiments of the silent era, which you see here on the left, Shreya Chatterjee has written about for our website, to the use of overseas labs for colour processing, to our contemporary moment when the world sends films to India for colour grading as part of its booming economy in digital post-production work. And there are really great oral history interviews on the website, on our website, by Julia Spivak and Shiryanshu Goa, who've interviewed digital colour graders working in India today. The material demands of shooting and printing films in colour helped drive these transnational exchanges. And this is something that I've been working on with Josie Deaker, and we're exploring in our co-authored essay for this screen dossier that we're working on. The fact that India had no facilities to make color negative, coupled with a weak currency and government restrictions on imports. So color film stock shortages plagued the Bombay film industry. So this spurred Indian filmmakers to negotiate with the US, Japan, Russia, but especially East Germany in order to secure supplies and learn processing techniques. These techniques demanded adaptation to work in the tropical climate of Bombay. And this is something that Ranjani also is thinking about in her work and will perhaps speak a little bit more about. And just to say that the work that Josie and I are doing, and I'm happy to speak more about, is about the development of the first domestically produced Indian colour film, Indu Colour, which was made with the help of East German technicians. And what you see it right here is a delegation of, with East German technicians. What you see it right here is a delegation of folks from India traveling to East Germany to learn and exchange knowledge about color film and film manufacturing. So to conclude, as Kartik Nair discusses in his essay for our forthcoming screen dossier, this dispersed internationalism of Bombay Film Colour complicates our understanding of where, when, and how colour meanings emerge in a film like Guide, and particularly its holy sequence. So if we want to understand colour in this film, do we look at the emulsion, which was applied in New York City, in upstate New York, to the pigments thrown before the camera in Mehboob Studios in Bombay? Do we look at the laboratory processing, which then happened in New York City? Or do we think about the digital color scan, which was produced in Mumbai by the DVD distributor Shemaru? So by grappling with this holy sequence, Nair invites us to think more carefully about how we read color in all global color film traditions. So kind of to conclude the big provocation of the project then, is to consider how understanding Bombay film colour doesn't just fill a gap in global colour film history, but makes us better film historians by producing more sensitive visual analysis, exploring alternative archival sources, and devising new methods to approach objects that don't fit our established frameworks. Okay, and so I'm now going to hand over to Ranjani. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hand over to Ranjani, who I hope is going to share some insights from the book that she's been working on, which focuses very specifically on this decade of the 1960s, which, as I say, emerged as the big kind of important decade from our project. So Ranjani, maybe I can hand over to you now.
Wow, I'm looking for my, yeah, okay, sorry. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I just finished my manuscript, and trying to capture a book when you've just finished it in 15 minutes is virtually impossible. So I've decided I'll just present the architecture of the book and hope that all of you will read it, and maybe we can have some discussion during the Q&A. Okay. Widely perceived as a cluster of experiences that stretched well beyond the decade, this 1960s drew into its fold radical politics, sexual liberation, youthful rebellion, consumerism, travel, fashion, music, architecture, cinema, and performance. The geography of color looks at the cultural resonance of the global 1960s from the vantage point of Bombay cinema as it made its transition from black and white to color. I argue that the dramatic shift to chromogenic monopack, marked by the introduction of Kodak's Eastman color film stock, ignited a geographical imagination in the 1960s. For large crowds in India accustomed to watching black and white films, which were largely shot in studio spaces or nearby outdoor locations, the surge of color was a novel experience that suddenly saw India emerge on screen as geographical space. Travel narratives became a recurring theme, with color stimulating encounters with the country's growing transport infrastructures, the railways, automobiles, and aviation, to redraw the country's map with a new affective space of desire and emotion. In contrast to the West, where the 1960s unfolded in an era of prosperity and abundance, color arrived in India during a decade of severe economic crisis. The appearance of a disconnection between the widespread economic crisis and the cinema of this emergent decade has often led to the latter being labeled as extravagant, escapist, and consumerist. This is a reading that I challenge in this book. Bombay Cinema's transition to color, as each of my chapters argues, was anything but a simple adoption of a new technology. Color reconfigured the domain of popular cinema by combining transnational practices with the socio-spatial context of India's historical milieu in the 1960s, just 2 decades after it became independent from colonial rule. Film crews searched for sites with a view to stoke the sensory experiences of audiences, accessing locations and transforming them into cinematic space. If asking questions about a cinematic world when it shifted to color is at the heart of this book, the answers it seeks are of a geographical nature, such as where is this location, what happens after cinema enters these locations, how do we make sense of scenic sites amplified by lyrics and musical compositions? What can this inquiry tell us about the intersection of infrastructure, environmental space, aesthetics, and film color? To address these questions, I embark on an imaginary voyage into the past, walking, traveling by train and jeep, and flying. The result is a story of the 1960s, when Bombay Cinema opened out a reservoir of spaces and ideas, prejudices and dreams, youth cultural aspirations, and travel economies. The first chapter analyzes the move to color in the 1960s through 5 lenses. The first is the financial implications of the shift when the Bombay film industry acutely experienced via difficulties with importing film stock. The second is an evaluation of changes in the production economy of studio spaces where indoor shooting was affected by an increase in temperature caused by additional lighting, and the negotiation of this excessive heat became crucial to the way the film industry developed new strategies. The third is the role of the mise-en-scène and the management of makeup and skin tone with color stop, especially in a context where light skin was favored. The fourth is the consolidation of Asia's first color laboratory in Bombay Film Center, which emerged as the nerve center of the industry with the transition to color. Finally, the chapter unpacks the way these shifts in industrial practices, along with an increased attention to tourism and outdoor spaces, significantly made Kashmir into a sought-after shooting location. Chapter 2 looks at how Bombay's chromatic turn inducted the railways as an infrastructure of romantic fantasy through encounters with India's wide range of scenic locations. The increase in railway passenger traffic in the 1960s emerged from the demands of tourism and government initiatives for employees to travel for their summer vacations. Special concessions were made available to youth and students, and the railway network was viewed as important in attracting both domestic and international tourists to gain foreign currency for an ailing economy. The railway imagination, as I argue, introduced locations with all the surge and splendor attached to color. The chapter analyzes 2 different types of attractions. The first is the hill station as a reconfigured spatial imagination, and the second is the dramatic use of historical monuments. The explicit and implicit presence of the train as a form of infrastructure introduced environments other than the confining space of the family, crossing virtual boundaries to open out the utopian in relation to everyday life. Chapter 3 shows how the influence of a developmental imagination began to shape the spatial context of cinema. Automobility and its intersection with India's highways created the context for an unveiling of India's diverse hinterland with color film stock. Anyone watching 1960s films can see how the most popular mode of transportation on the highway was the Indian version of the Willys Jeep, a blue-gray vehicle that was introduced to India via an Indian company called Mahindra and Mahindra. The Jeep's appearance in advertisements seemed to convey that the vehicle would aid the development process that started soon after independence. Unlike the railways chapters in imagination of hill stations and heritage sites, this chapter looks at the radiating force of color as it framed the vast canvas of the hinterland in films, including agricultural land and forests as spaces that played out the fantasy of romance. Color provided a visual sensibility to stage the signs of development, with the Jeep moving across bridges, embankments, highways, tunnels, and timber piles. The forest emerges on screen as a site of production, conspiracy, and extraction, as well as a chromatically charged space of mystery, hallucinatory experiences, and a fear of wild animals. The final part of the chapter looks closely at the transnational cultural traffic that gave form to a film called Aadmi Aur Insaan, which has the construction of a dam at the center of the narrative. As I argued, the aesthetic interventions of Soviet constructivism and socialist realism on the one hand, and American projections of the technological sublime on the other, strangely played out through Cold War networks that enabled the circulation of glossy magazines with color spreads in India. These influences find their way into the visual design of Aadmi Aur Insaan, where the film destabilizes the discourse of development by using color to contrast the spectacle of engineering feats with lavish architectural decor, design, costume, and high melodrama. Chapter 4 establishes the role of aviation in the creation of a postcard imagination in color, inviting spectators to encounter global cities. The first part of the chapter introduces Air India, founded originally in 1932 as Tata Airlines, then nationalized by the government in 1953 as Air India. The first Boeing 707 arrived in 1960, and 2 years later, Air India became the world's first all-jet airline. Though a national airline, Air India was unique in its lack of nationalist anxiety. Nowhere was this more evident than in the airline's most successful mascot, the irreverent Maharaja in his red cloak and turban, linking international air travel with an erotic charge. Initially shown as black and white sketches in print advertisements, by the 1960s, the Maharaja began to appear in color on posters, in advertisements, and as display object. In my analysis, the chromatically enhanced global city with its displays of fashion, nightclubs, street culture, public transportation, and water fountains was laced both with sexual transgression as well as a moralizing discourse that identified Indianness as distinct from the cultures of the West. I connect cinematic global space and its imagination to a series of events in the public domain. These include a major debate on whether the kiss should be allowed on screen, a scandal that saw popular film actress Sharmila Tagore pose in a bikini in the media to publicize An Evening in Paris, the film, one of the global travel films, and the constitution of an inquiry committee known as the Khosla Committee to assess and regulate what was perceived as an increased depiction of sexual permissiveness and obscenity on screen after the introduction of color. In the last section of the chapter, I look at India's fascination with Japan as a hyper-modern landscape, highlighting the confluence of infrastructural spectacle, dreams of Asian modernization, and the growing ubiquity of travel culture. Films focused on colorful urban landscapes featuring intricate roadways and luminous neon lights at night. The global infrastructural boom with airlines in the 1960s generated a new travel utopias, while color enhanced the desire to cross borders physically and imaginatively. The final chapter moves to a geography of public and private interiors created by art directors. The focus is on the cosmopolitan visual culture that art directors tapped into for designed interiors constructed in studio spaces. I focus on the role of art direction, including certain practitioners, to establish a transnational traffic of design strategies that reframe the geography of the interior. Color generated an awareness of the object and architectural world presented on screen through surface color and the use of colored light. The chapter adopts 4 different entry points to the Bombay film interior. The first is the interior stage. The second is the role of the grand staircase and piano in framing the wealthy home as private property. The third is the way the house transforms into a site of estrangement and psychic conflict using media objects such as black and white photographs, paintings, colored periodicals, still and home movie cameras. Such intermediate occurrences both reinforced and exploded the screen fantasy of private property. Finally, in the last section of the chapter, I keep my focus on the Anglo-Indian dancing star Helen and her appearance across different films to frame the imagination of the nightclub as a public interior. Her mix of Spanish, French, and Burmese blood resulted in an appearance where she looked more white than Asian. While Helen made her appearance in Bombay Cinema in the black and white era, the performance of her whiteness took shape only after the transition to color, as the nightclub became the site for experimentation with dance, light, and racial anxieties. Thank you. Did I stick to time?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. It was fascinating to hear more about the archival research that's integral to understanding the historical specificity, the presence of colour, its politics, geographies, and its musical kind of connections.